I used to live in the city, in an urban area. That lifestyle was what I had always wanted and imagined. However, after an extremely traumatic experience, I couldn't handle even the smallest noises. I began to hate noise in general. My psychiatrist told me I had developed a rare case of phonophobia. That tingling sensation you feel when your foot falls asleep was something similar, but in my chest, as if my body was constantly on alert for something that never came. Every car horn or door slam felt like a direct jolt to my nerves. I couldn't keep living like that. About 3 years ago, I found a cabin hidden deep in the Pacific Northwest. I don't want to say exactly where it was for reasons you'll soon understand, but I'll say it was somewhere in Montana. It seemed perfect to me. Very few neighbors, no traffic, and almost no cell signal. What really convinced me was the lack of noise. It was just me and the peace and quiet. For the first time in months, I thought I could really feel safe. The cabin itself was small but cozy. It was exactly what the listing had promised. You could tell it had been built to last, with thick wooden beams and a sturdy stone fireplace. It smelled of pine and old books when I first walked in, that kind of earthy aroma that's almost comforting. Think of one of those old bed and breakfast cabins for those who have gone skiing before. The nearest neighbor lived about 15 minutes away on foot, down a narrow dirt path. I didn't meet her right away, as I spent the first few days just immersing myself in the silence. Waking up to the sound of birds instead of sirens, and at night, the only thing you could hear was the wind blowing through the trees. It was as if the whole world had pressed pause, and I could finally breathe again. I did all my work from my laptop, so there was really no need to connect with the outside world. About a week after moving in, I heard a knock on the door. The cabin obviously didn't have a doorbell, so those knocks were something I would have to get used to. I opened the door expecting it to be my neighbor, and it was. She was a middle-aged woman, carrying a basket of preserves as if she had just stepped out of a Lifetime movie. She introduced herself as Linda and said she lived about 15 minutes down the trail. It didn't seem far until you considered the density of the forest. You could easily get lost just looking for firewood. Linda was about 63 years old, with strangely long gray hair and piercing blue eyes that made you feel like she could see right through you. She wasn't rude, more like brusque. She welcomed me to the woods and extended the basket to me as if expecting me to take it. I really didn't have many options, as she was putting it in my face. I know it sounds hospitable, but her demeanor seemed a bit out of place, if that makes sense. I took it impulsively, but I admit that no neighbor had ever treated me like that before. It wasn't anything crazy, but it wasn't something I was used to. I thanked her as I took the basket, and she looked at me as if expecting me to say something more. Honestly, I didn't know what else to say, so I just smiled. She continued to look at me awkwardly, which confirmed my suspicion that this woman didn't interact much with other people. Finally, she spoke and said some exact words I'll never forget. Always keep your flashlights full, your wits shut, and your wits sharper than your axe. It wasn't something a normal person would say to another. It was as if she was reciting a rule book. Honestly, it sounded more like a warning than advice. I nodded, smiled, and turned to go back inside. After closing the door, I stood there in silence, waiting to hear her footsteps fade away. She didn't walk away for a good 50 seconds, which was probably the strangest part of the whole interaction. Despite the odd vibe, I appreciated her kindness. She seemed lonely, but not unfriendly, the kind of person who would help you if you asked but wouldn't bother to intrude. It was comforting to know there was someone nearby, even though I didn't plan on needing her help. I didn't even bother to look inside the basket. I just left it in the living room and forgot about it. That night there was a thunderstorm, something extremely rare in Montana, but it happens. I lit some candles and curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the fact that the power was flickering every few minutes. Some might find that kind of isolation scary, but I loved it. For some reason, my brain wasn't scared by the natural sounds of the storm. In fact, it was that specific storm that made me realize how calming it could be. I listened intently to everything happening outside, and it was, I must say, soothing. But of course, that sense of peace didn't last long. A few hours after the storm started, there was a knock on the door that almost made me jump out of my skin. I say knock, but it was more like a loud bang and definitely unnatural, as if whoever it was didn't care that it was raining outside. My heart started pounding, and I felt that horrible tingling sensation in my chest. After hesitating for a few moments, I grabbed the flashlight and went to see who it was. I looked through the small glass pane next to the door. She was soaked to the bone and holding a flashlight. I opened the door, and she spoke before I could greet her. She said she had seen someone near my woodpile and thought I should know. I was more than confused, but her words were incredibly concerning and took priority. I stepped onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the rain, but I couldn't see anything but trees. I asked if she was sure, and she nodded. Her eyes kept darting toward the woods, as if she expected someone to emerge at any moment. It was all quite strange. I kept looking around, but there wasn't much I could make out in the darkness and chaos of the storm. Before I could say anything else, she told me to be careful and started to leave without waiting for a response. I watched her walk down the path to her cabin, seemingly unfazed by the pouring rain. I stayed there until the glow of her flashlight disappeared from view, and then I went back inside. As soon as I closed the door, I realized her story was full of holes. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile if her house was 12 minutes away? She must have been on my property from the start. Why would she be snooping around my cabin during a storm? Was she lying? I didn't feel good about any of this, but going to her house in the middle of a storm was the last thing I was going to do. Still, I had to do something. I secured the cabin as best as I could and sat in my room, listening to the storm that began to subside after a while, but I still felt quite uneasy. A few hours passed without incident, so I decided it was probably safe to go to sleep. I don't remember exactly what time it was, but shortly after midnight, I woke up to the sound of a branch snapping right outside my bedroom window. I am a very light sleeper, so I was completely sure it was a branch breaking and nothing else. I froze in place for a few tense seconds, listening. Finally, I crawled to the window, hoping not to see anything. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I saw Harriet was Linda. She was standing at the edge of the woods, her body turned away from my house. I recognized her by her hair, which was long and unkempt. I strained to see more, but with only the moonlight, it wasn't easy. I saw her start to turn around, so I ducked below the window before she could catch me watching her. I stayed crouched there for what felt like an eternity, and finally gathered the courage to look again. She was gone. I really didn't know what to do. I hadn't exactly labeled her as dangerous, just strange, but at that moment, I was reconsidering everything. Why would she try to warn me earlier if she was the one snooping around? I couldn't sleep for hours, determined to stay awake until dawn. A few hours passed, and I started to feel tired, just as I was beginning to relax a bit. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the door. It didn't sound like the previous knock. It was quite soft. Even so, I had no intention of getting up under any circumstances. The tingling sensation returned as I quietly approached the door. I peeked through the glass and froze in horror. It wasn't Linda, but a burly, bald man with a thick beard. I had to fight every urge in my body not to scream in fear. The situation suddenly became much more terrifying. As quietly as I could, I retreated to the bathroom, closed the door, and called the police. While I was talking to them, I started hearing bangs on the front door, as if someone was repeatedly hitting it with a heavy object. The operator assured me that help was on the way and asked me not to hang up. I stayed there, more terrified than I had ever been in my life. Finally, the front door gave way, and I heard it slam open. I really thought I was going to die. That man, whoever he was, started smashing things in my cabin. At least that's what it sounded like, with glass breaking and wood splintering. I didn't dare make a sound. Luckily, that man didn't seem to be looking for me, as I never heard his footsteps leave the living room. Eventually, the crashing noise stopped, and I was left in complete silence again, fighting a panic attack the whole time. To my surprise, the police arrived quite quickly, but not soon enough to catch that guy in the act. He was long gone by then. I begged the officers to help me, but they were frankly useless. They did a pathetic search of the surrounding property, but that was it. They didn't even agree to search the woods, saying it was too dense and that it was unlikely they would find him there anyway. I pleaded with them to at least accompany me to Linda's house, to which they agreed. When we arrived at her property, I was stunned. The entire cabin was abandoned. The police confirmed it and said no one had lived there in decades. I told them they needed to search for squatters, but they told me there was no reason to do so. They said there were no clear signs of habitation, so it would be a waste of time. I nearly lost my mind hearing that. I tried to argue, but they basically told me that living in the woods was a risk I had chosen to take, and that it wasn't their problem. They left after that, which infuriated me. Obviously, I moved out of that cabin, but not without spending one more night there. It was horrible, but I got through it without anything else happening. Since then, things have been good for me, but I still constantly think about that experience. Some of my superstitious friends have theorized that Linda was actually a spirit trying to protect me, and that she was just trying to watch over my property for some reason. I don't believe in the paranormal, so I think it's much more likely that Linda and that man were squatting in that abandoned cabin. I still don't understand why they decided to target me, or why Linda didn't warn me if they were planning to break into my house. I don't think I'll ever know. This happened a few months ago. I've been working as a driver for a ride-sharing service for several years, and I usually prefer night shifts. The roads are quieter, and the tips are often better. However, every now and then, you have an experience that sticks with you, and not in a good way. I've always considered myself a careful person, and have dealt with my share of strange passengers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what I'm about to tell you. At that time, I didn't have a dash cam, and that night was the main reason I decided to install one. Everything started normally, just me and the strange sounds of my car. I drive a pretty beat-up but reliable 2010 Toyota. The streets were literally deserted, which, as I mentioned before, I prefer. Sometime after 3 a.m., I received a pickup request at a nearby convenience store. At first, it seemed harmless, but for some reason, I had a strange feeling. Have you ever felt like something was wrong, but you can't explain why? That's exactly what I felt while driving, even before I saw the guy. When I arrived, all the lights in the store were off, and there wasn't a single car in the parking lot. As I got closer, I saw him. I drove slowly to get a good look at him. He was wandering outside the store wearing a tattered hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. It literally had a hole in the sleeve. His movements were jerky, as if he couldn't stay still, and he kept looking over his shoulder, as if he thought someone was following him. If I had to guess, I'd say he was under the influence of something. I probably should have canceled the ride and driven away. I even moved my finger over the cancel button, but for some reason, I didn't. I opened the doors, and he slid into the back seat without saying a word. I regretted my decision the moment I took my foot off the brake. Most people either scroll through their phones or stare out the window, but not him. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror, without blinking or looking away. I tried not to stare back, but I couldn't help it. I caught his eye a couple of times, and he returned my gaze with a bit of anger, which was also quite unsettling. I tried to ignore him and turned on the radio to break the silence. I don't even remember what station I put on, but the moment the music started playing, he yelled at me to turn it off. His voice was deep and a bit raspy, and I realized he was a smoker. That put me on alert immediately. I resisted the urge to look at him in the mirror and just did what he said, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I didn't say anything, and we continued in silence for a while. I thought maybe he would just sit there quietly until we reached his destination. At least that's what I hoped. But then he spoke, and I remember the conversation as if it were yesterday. He asked if I had ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. That question hit me like a brick. I let out an awkward laugh and said, "Well, I hope not," trying to keep the mood light, but he didn't react. He just reclined and muttered something to himself that I couldn't hear. Then he started talking about how he used to be an Uber driver and quit because some kids stole things from his car. He slurred his words a bit, so I couldn't understand everything he said, but I got the gist of his story. As he talked, I looked at him in the rearview mirror a couple of times and noticed he was smiling the whole time, which was incredibly unsettling. A normal person wouldn't smile while talking about something like that. He concluded his story by saying it's curious how much trust we place in someone sitting right behind us. That comment made me see him as more than just a simple threat, more than a crazy drug addict. Unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do about it. I felt my pulse quicken. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. I looked at the GPS, focusing on the destination, as if it were some kind of lifeline, but the guy didn't know when to stop talking. He kept babbling nonsense, some of which was concerning and some just gibberish that I honestly couldn't follow. Finally, he started apologizing to someone, though I don't think it was me. He began to hint that he had done something terrible and that he was a bad person, repeatedly saying he didn't mean to do it, followed by a few frantic, "I'm sorries." I didn't respond, worried he might do something if I did. I didn't know what he had done or what he was capable of, but I wasn't about to find out. We were just a few minutes from his stop when he snapped out of his mumbling haze and yelled at me that I had missed the turn. I hadn't missed it. The GPS clearly showed we were on the right track. But I slammed on the brakes anyway, mostly out of fear. He demanded that I stop, and that's what I did. My hands were shaking at that point. I just wanted the nightmare to end. As soon as I put the car in park, headlights appeared behind us. It was a police car. I said a silent prayer and watched as it slowly approached. A spotlight briefly passed over my car, and the guy in the back seat slumped down as if trying to stay out of sight. I turned my head and saw him lying almost perfectly flat in the back seat, with his eyes closed. I turned my head back before he saw me, trying to keep my breathing steady. He stayed in that uncomfortable position for what felt like an eternity. I wanted to ask him to leave, but I finally decided not to. He lifted his head and told me I was lucky before he could do anything. He opened my car door and disappeared. I ended my shift shortly after that, shocked and with no desire to keep driving. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I came across something on my phone that showed how dangerous the situation had been. According to a news article, a convenience store had been robbed the night I picked up that passenger. It was 2 blocks from where I had picked him up. It makes me sick to know I was inches away from a dangerous criminal who could have harmed me if he had wanted to. I'm a bit scared to contact the police about this. I try to avoid law enforcement for various personal reasons I won't get into. I'm not sure if my report would be helpful anyway. Now I'm much more cautious about who I let into my car. My name is Jake, and my girlfriend is Sarah. We met 3 years ago when I was a freshman in college. We both attend Harvard, which has been my dream school since I was 8 years old. Neither of us is from Massachusetts. In fact, we are both from Texas. She is from Houston, and I'm from just outside Austin. I think that's a big reason why we felt so drawn to each other. I believe people from similar places tend to connect naturally. Harvard isn't a huge university, but most of the students are from Massachusetts, so being from the Midwest makes us stand out. One of the traditions we've created is how we split Christmas between our families. Sarah is very loved by my relatives, so her presence is always appreciated and welcomed, almost expected. Since her house is only a 2-hour drive from mine, we decided early on to spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrate that night, and then drive overnight to her house for Christmas Day. Until I met her, I didn't realize that most families celebrate Christmas on the 25th and not the night before. Interestingly, my favorite part of the holidays isn't Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, but that nighttime drive that has become a small tradition for us, something we both look forward to each year. The first time we did it remains one of my favorite memories with her. From where I live, the fastest route to her house doesn't take us on a main highway. Most of the journey is on quiet back roads, surrounded by fields and trees, and occasionally a distant farm. Really late at night, with the isolated route, we rarely encounter other cars. It feels like the world is asleep, and we have it all to ourselves. We don't laugh, but we always play Juice WRLD's music during the drive. His music has been a shared obsession since we met. I know his music can be a bit embarrassing, but there's something special about singing the lyrics together. It's like we're in sync. This last Christmas Eve started like any other. After a pleasant evening with my extended family, we packed my car around midnight and hit the road. It was lightly snowing, and the roads were deserted, as expected. With the music and the heat turned up, everything felt perfect. However, everything changed in an instant. What I'm about to describe remains one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. As I was driving, the music was interrupted by the sound of my phone. I was a bit annoyed to receive a call at that hour. It was an unknown number. I ignored it without thinking, probably a scam call. Those things are constant these days. Sarah joked about how dedicated those call center guys must be to make calls on Christmas. We laughed, and that was it. But a few minutes later, my phone rang again. I looked down and saw it was another unknown number, probably the same as before. I was irritated, but I let it go to voicemail. Sarah looked at me and raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. I showed her the phone to prove it was an unknown number, and she commented that it was very strange, with a puzzled expression. I didn't respond, just shrugged. The music finally resumed, and I tried not to think about the phone calls. Of course, not even 2 minutes passed before my phone rang again. I got angry at that point, cursing under my breath as I fumbled for my phone. I grabbed it from the console and aggressively tapped the screen, ready to tell whoever it was to stop bothering me. Sarah was startled when my body tensed with my sudden movements. In hindsight, I probably overreacted, but I was fed up with being harassed. I answered the phone with a hello in the loudest tone I could muster, expecting the typical scam script to start. Instead, I was met with silence. I turned up the car's volume and immediately heard a faint static from the other side of the line. I was about to hang up when a male voice spoke. It wasn't a voice I recognized. When he said, "Hello, Jake," I was so shocked that I almost lost control of the car. I couldn't speak. I felt my whole body start to itch, something that always happens when I'm nervous. Before I could respond, the man continued and began reciting personal information, my full name, my address, details of my life that a stranger shouldn't know. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to pull over to the side of the road, but I kept driving as if I were in a trance. I considered yelling at him, but decided that anger wasn't the best option in this situation. After a few tense moments, I finally spoke and asked him what he wanted, trying to hide the fear in my voice. The voice paused before saying something that chilled me to the bone. He wasn't there for me, but for Catherine. Hearing my girlfriend's name was 100 times more terrifying than hearing my own. The look of horror on her face told me she was as shocked as I was. I quickly said I didn't know any Catherine, that he must have the wrong number. The man chuckled before saying she was sitting right next to me. That was too much for me, so I pulled over to the side of the road. I had no other choice. My hands were shaking with fear. I didn't know what to say when Catherine, in a quick motion, hung up the phone. I literally shouted, demanding to know why she had hung up when a stranger was threatening us. She didn't respond, just looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. I desperately tried to call back once, twice, 3 times, but it never connected. Catherine told me to keep driving, which I did, but not before questioning her. She said she was scared, and I couldn't blame her for hanging up. I guess it was fair, so I stayed silent, but I still couldn't understand why she had hung up. I didn't know if I was more angry or scared. Part of me hoped that number would call back, but after about 15 minutes, I felt it was becoming increasingly unlikely. At one point, I looked at Catherine and saw tears in her eyes. She told me she didn't feel safe, and that made a knot form in my stomach. I nodded, even though Catherine and I had already been through a lot in our relationship, and I knew that trust isn't always easy. There had been small lies, moments of half-truths, where I had caught her being less than honest. I knew I was being paranoid, but how could she have done something to cause this? The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't play music again, and neither of us spoke. My mind kept spinning with a million unanswered questions. Who was that guy? How did he know so much about me? Only my family knew we were driving that night, and they never mentioned it to anyone. I was 100% sure it wasn't a prank. I couldn't think of another explanation. Even when we finally arrived at Catherine's house, I didn't feel much better. It's been almost a month since this happened, and I still haven't gotten any answers. None of our family members were responsible. We asked them all. Catherine swears she's as baffled as I am, which leads me to believe that the person on the other end of the call had sinister intentions. I might be overreacting to something harmless, but I'm telling you, aside from our family, there's no one in the world who knew Catherine and I would be driving that night. I've been really tense since then, and I can't help but jump every time my phone rings. I know he'll eventually call back. It's just a matter of time.